Hey everyone, so I really wanted to do one of these videos on the belief in the real presence. There was a couple articles coming out recently, or maybe just one big major study, followed by a couple other articles talking about people not believing in the real presence anymore. That Catholics attending Mass don't believe in the real presence, and of course that many Catholics are no longer attending Mass, even. So I want to talk about maybe why that is. So there was a lot of, I know the USCCB shared an article and they were asking what can we do to encourage belief in the real presence. And my local diocese shared a similar article and was also wondering what could be done. So perhaps this video might offer some ideas of what might be done, what the reason for this lack of belief in the real presence might, some reasons for why that is. Um, so, first and foremost, I would say that disbelief in the real presence is a consequence of catechesis, of having poor catechesis, unfortunately, and people just don't understand, right? First of all, people just don't know. Maybe they haven't been told, or they haven't been told in a way that makes sense. Now, the problem with that is that you don't necessarily, the best way to learn isn't always necessarily to be told. So even though people aren't being told, I don't think, even if they are being told, it's still not going to really cut it. There's this, a friend of mine shared an article that was saying something like, the title of the article was something like, teaching the real presence without words. And it kind of made me think about this idea in writing, where like the first thing that you ever learn if you're doing any sort of writing is show, don't tell, right? So let's say I write a story about a character who's some kind of really powerful knight or something, and all these guys are trying to fight him and no one wants to fight him because he's so strong or something, and everyone keeps talking about how strong he is, but you never actually really see that. Like maybe the characters all just go and easily beat him up, right? So you set up these expectations for your audience by telling them this knight is so strong, but then when it really comes down to things, you don't actually see that in practice, which makes for disbelief. The audience is like, is this guy really so strong? I don't quite see that. I don't really feel it, right? When it comes to something like the liturgy, where the real presence of the Eucharist occurs, where Christ is made present, I think a similar principle needs to be incorporated. You can't just be telling people, behold, this is your Lord, because they're not necessarily going to believe it just because you're saying it. Now, so another thing is that people nowadays are only, especially young people, they want to take things seriously. I'm convinced that people, perhaps around my age and perhaps younger, people that are maybe in their teens now, I think there is a desire to take things seriously, whatever that might be, and they look for that in various things. But they're not going to really pay attention to something if the people that are trying to convey it to them themselves aren't taking it seriously. So, okay, so step 1, show, don't tell. Step 2, take it seriously. So that means that priests need to believe wholeheartedly in the real presence. I'm not saying they don't, I'm saying people need to know that they believe it. So I think, I obviously I love the Latin Mass, and I want to maybe see, well, okay, when I first went to the Latin Mass, I just felt like, I didn't know why, but I felt like I really knew that it was Christ present. you know, I often talk about with my dad, like in the past, we'd always, whenever we talk about faith and stuff, we would sometimes talk about um, why why is it so hard to focus at Mass? Like why am I not thinking about what's actually going on? In Latin Mass, you don't even need to try. At least I didn't. You just kind of get it, right? And you actually don't hear the words of consecration. You don't hear the entire canon at the Latin Mass. The priest is silent, so there's no telling. You don't hear the priest saying in persona Christi, "This is my body, this is my blood." You don't hear that. You only hear, you hear nothing. He does say, "Behold the Lamb of God," later on when he turns around and when he's about to give Holy Communion, but he's not. You don't hear it when it happens. But that silence during the canon really lets you know that something is going on here. Let me tell you, when the bells ring, it's not uncommon for all, because there's a lot of babies crying at Latin Mass. The babies, this isn't necessarily true every single time, but the babies stop crying when the bells ring. And maybe that's just because it's bells, but there's just this sense that something very powerful is going on. You just kind of feel it, because the conveyance is very strong. Everybody there is taking it seriously. The priest is taking it super seriously. When the priest does the consecration, when he lifts up the Eucharist, at that moment, at the Latin Mass, he can no longer separate his fingers. He keeps them like this. He lifts up the chalice in this way where he holds his fingers together, and he's not going to separate them until, obviously to lift up every individual Eucharist, but other than that, he keeps them together until the purification. Only after that can he actually release his fingers. And that is hugely important, because that's no longer necessary in the Novus Ordo. As well as just the way that the priest consumes the Eucharist is different. The way that not even the altar servers are allowed to touch the chalice. In Novus Ordo, as an altar server, I would move the chalice. And it's not, it just adds a layer of seriousness to, if no one, if only the priest can touch the Eucharist and the chalice, you just know that it's sacred, right? Also, all of these extra, protections surrounding the Eucharist, there's the corporal, and then there's the corporal sleeve. You keep the corporal inside another thing, and you just there's so much care taken that not a single particle of the Eucharist is lost. Within reason, right, as much as possible, and that really helps you to know. And then when you have a situation where even if the priest at a Novus Ordo Mass reverently consumes the Eucharist and is distributing it to the people, the fact that we receive it standing, when I'm at a Novus Ordo, I do receive standing. I do receive on the tongue now. I used to receive on the hand. But receiving the Eucharist on the hand is also a detraction. It's also another way of subtly saying, without really saying anything, but showing that this is just another ordinary food, that this is not Christ, because you can just take it and eat it. And people can say, well, okay, Christ wants to give himself to us freely, and that's certainly true. That's certainly true. But there's this quote that I love that my dad told me from a saint, and we're not sure which saint it is. I should probably look it up. But he says to Christ, "You call me friend, but to me you are my Lord." So we should always approach Christ with utmost reverence, and that's how we know that the Eucharist is so important. If we approach the Eucharist and we receive it as little children, right? We receive it kneeling on the tongue, which is done in Latin Mass all the time. That really shows you how real it really is. So Hopefully this video has given you something to think about. We can talk about in the comments. What do you guys think? Are these really good ways for people to help people understand the real presence, or are there better ways? Are there different reasons why people maybe don't believe in the Eucharist? Obviously, this is just a starting point. There's so much more to talk about. But thanks so much for watching. Next time I think we'll talk about active participation. Should be fun. So thanks so much for watching, and see you next time.